How many people are registered for the webinar? Just curious.
We have about 57,
Okay.
but sometimes it take a while to come in. So we can get started whenever.
Okay. All right, sure. And Nate, you're ready, right?
Sure, indeed.
Okay, awesome. Good morning, everyone. My name is Stefan Mahabir. I am the 2023 Chair of LiveWare's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, and I'd like to welcome you to our first Wednesday webinar in a series of 4 webinars this month. And these webinars are offered in co-sponsorship with the New York State Association of Realtors, and they feature national presenters and LiveWare's Associate Counsel, Patrick Fife, who will be our presenters on this important subject. Realtors are charged with upholding fair housing laws, as well as offering professional services to all of those in search of housing. Realtors are committed to abiding by fair housing laws and our Realtor Code of Ethics, which state equality for all in the search of real property. LiveWare leadership and its DEI committee are also committed to providing our membership with the tools, education, and resources they need to stay informed and to assist and serve all those seeking housing fairly and equally. Today's presenter is Nate K. Johnson. He's the president of Real Estate Solutions, which is a full-service commercial and residential real estate brokerage with a commitment to helping clients achieve their goals. Nate also serves in an agent development role for Red Key Real Estate Leaders, which is the largest independent real estate brokerage in St. Louis. In addition to representing buyers and sellers in real estate transactions, Nate manages a sales staff while overseeing the daily operations of Real Estate Solutions. Nate is the 2021 chairman of the Sustainability Advisory Group for the National Association of Realtors and served as the 2018 president of the Missouri Association of Realtors and the 2011 president of the St. Louis Association of Realtors. Nate currently serves as a president of the board of directors of the Metropolitan St. Louis Equal Housing Opportunity Council, which is the only nonprofit fair housing enforcement agency working to end illegal housing discrimination in St. Louis. Nate speaks to groups all over the country about fair housing, diversity and inclusion, as well as smart growth and sustainability. Nate instructs a variety of courses relating to these topics and more, including the Realtor Code of Ethics, business development, and leadership. Nate has a passion for helping people achieve their real estate goals, and he believes that education is the best way to ensure that they are prepared to make good decisions. With that being said, here is Nate. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for that lovely introduction. It's great to be with all of you again. And I'll tell you, I am really looking forward to having this conversation with you and being able to share with you a little bit about the brief history of fair housing. And we're also going to cover 5 keys to fostering an inclusive environment. I know that I was with you before and shared a really brief history of fair housing. So a lot of that doesn't change, but I really worked to make sure that I included some additional content that hopefully will help you, discover the best way that your association and that your community can become more inclusive. So with that, let's kick it off. We're going to start going back in time, as you know, 1865. Anybody remember 1865? What was happening in 1865? Of course, we know that we had the Civil War ending in 1865, and that was, a very pivotal point in our nation's history. We arrived at a space where, how are we going to bring our country together that has been torn apart? Abraham Lincoln said that with malice towards none and charity for all, let's heal the nation's wounds. That's what he was most interested in doing, and that was certainly his approach in creating better outcomes for our fragile nation. Now, we've got a challenge in terms of after the Emancipation Proclamation, after the end of the Civil War, we have all of these free men and women. And the question becomes, what are we going to do with all of these free men and women? And this sort of leads into the first 5 points in that I want to make about creating an inclusive environment. And that point is to talk less and listen more, okay? Because if you truly want to deepen your level of understanding as it relates to how different groups experience the world, you really need to create a space or enter a space where the lines of communication are open and listen. And when you're listening, you're not talking. So what that means is we don't want to compare tragedies and injustices. I know sometimes in an effort to relate, we may want to share something that happened to us when we hear something that happened to somebody else. But that's not what we want to do, because what's happening here is we're looking to arrive at a space of understanding. And when we're listening, it's not about you. It's not about me. It's about the person that you're listening to. So you're seeking to understand, and this only happens when you're taking in the information. Listening also is going to include reading books, watching movies, documentaries, podcasts, all of those things. And what I challenge you to do is think about how you feel after you read something, after you listen to something, after you watch a presentation like this today. What are you feeling? And sort of sit with that and ask yourselves the question about, why is it that I feel that way? What could be the cause of the way that I feel in this existence, in this space? Okay, so getting back to President Lincoln, looking to bring the country back together. One of the things that we want to do, a great example of talking less and listening more is what President Lincoln did. He dispatched his General George Tecumseh Sherman, to speak with one of the leaders of the freedmen. And the leader of the freedmen, his name was Garrison Frazier. And he did something that was quite phenomenal. We're talking about 1865. He's going to meet with a leader of the freedmen and women to ask them a question. And that question was, what do you want? What is it that you want for your people? So General Sherman, instead of going and saying, this is what we're going to do, this is what you're going to get, he asked the question, what is it that you want? So that's a perfect example of talking less and listening more. Don't assume the solution. Ask, and you'll be surprised what you may uncover and discover when the person on the other side of the table speaks their mind and their truth. And so Garrison Frazier, in response to the question, what is it you want for your own people? Garrison said that, he said that the best way that we can take care of ourselves is to have land, turn it and till it by our own labor, and we'll be able to maintain ourselves and potentially have something to spare. We want to be placed on land until we're able to buy it and make it our own. So there we have it, 1865. Real estate is what we needed. Real estate is what Garrison Frazier wanted for his people. And that made a lot of sense to General Sherman. General Sherman took that back to President Lincoln, made a lot of sense to him as well. So as a result of that, what we saw was Special Field Order number 15. Now, Special Field Order number 15 said this: the islands from Charleston south, the abandoned rice fields along the rivers for 30 miles back from the sea, and the country bordering the St. Johns River in Florida are reserved and set apart for the settlement of Negroes now made free by acts of war and by the proclamation of the President of the United States. So there we have it. We've got a solution here. And you may know this as 40 acres and a mule. Now, there was no mule involved, but of this land, yes, each family was to get about 40 acres so that they could, as Garrison Frazier said, till the soil with their own hands and become productive members of our society as a result of that. So this was a fantastic way that we were going to work to move our country forward by creating some equitable opportunities for those that have worked for free under enslavement for so many years. So let's talk a little bit about in-group and out-group dynamics. Let's take a little shift here. And when we talk about, what was taking place with Garrison Frazier and General Sherman and others that all of a sudden had different conversations than were being had previously, because we know there's a different conversation that you're having with someone who is viewed as property versus a conversation that you're having with someone who is viewed as a man or as a woman. And so when we think about in-group and out-group dynamics, we kind of have to fast forward a little bit to today and see how that looks. Because what we know is that it's easy to engage with people that we know and share inside jokes and history and things like that, but that often doesn't resonate with everyone. And a good example of this would be when you're at your association, when you're at the Long Island Board of Realtors, and you're going into a group, and all of a sudden someone that may not be like you is in the room. They don't feel terribly comfortable necessarily because they're a member of the out group. And what happens is members of the in are often talking amongst themselves, and they don't really reach out to be inclusive to the person who is part of that out group. So it's very challenging. We really have to look for ways to be intentionally inclusive when we're trying to create cohesion among various diverse groups of people. And when we talk about diverse groups of people, one of the things we've got to make sure to understand is that the goal of diversity is inclusion, not just diversity in itself. Because with diversity in and of itself, yes, you may have different perspectives around the table, so to speak, different ethnicities, different genders, different age groups, different socioeconomic representation there. However, if the space is not created for these diverse groups to feel comfortable speaking their truth, then you're missing the whole point, and you're not going to experience the richness that is provided by cultivating a diverse climate. Because diversity in and of itself is not the goal. It's about making sure that all voices are heard, respected, and valued within that space. So I mentioned talking less and listening more, of course. And I'll tell you, here's a great example of that. So there was an Italian study, and this was from Psychology in the Schools. This goes back to 2012. So there was an Italian study that assigned middle school children to either read a book about a positive interaction between their culture and another culture, read an unrelated book, or read no book at all. And the results were pretty fascinating, because when asked afterwards about their feelings towards the out group, immigrants living in, the out group who were immigrants that were living in Italy, students who had read about the intercultural exchange reported having fewer negative stereotypes about immigrants, favorable attitudes, and more interest in interacting with immigrants. And they also identified less as an in-group member. So this is a phenomenal study that really shows that by talking less and listening more, reading books, and really working to empathize with others, it puts you in a position to really truly have a deeper understanding of their challenges and opportunities, their hopes and dreams. And as a result, you're less likely to see them as the out member, and more than likely, you're going to start to, pull down your own sort of guard as it relates to you being a member of the in-group. And that's how we work to create that inclusive environment, by talking less and listening more. So if we go back to what was happening 100 years ago, 150 years ago. So this is Andrew Johnson. And what we know that is that after President Lincoln issued Special Field Order number 15, which was going to disperse thousands of acres to recently enslaved people that was confiscated from the Confederacy, everything was moving along swimmingly until President Lincoln had a really rough night in the theater, as we know. And as a result of that tragic evening where Lincoln was assassinated, we saw the emergence of Andrew Johnson as president. Now, Andrew Johnson was in no way the great emancipator that President Lincoln was. In fact, Andrew Johnson was a slaveholder himself at time, and he was a known segregationist and white supremacist. So he said, no, we're not giving this land back to these people. So he took the land back that was set aside and reserved for Negroes now made free by proclamation and the acts of war and proclamation of the President of the United States, as Special Field Order stated. And he gave the land back to the Confederates who fought against the Union Army during the Civil War. So there we have it. We started to see a little bit of the sun come out in terms of the recently enslaved people, but we sort of slid back based on President Johnson's repeal of Special Field Order number 15. So we're still in a space that we've got to figure out what we're going to do with all of these freed men and women. Because, as you might know, there was no such thing as, what was happening is that people were like, okay, slavery is abolished, the war is over, off you go. There wasn't any real plan in place for what to do with all of these recently enslaved people. So as a result, many of them were forced to continue to work as laborers for the very plantation owners that once owned them as property. So we get to 1866, and Congress sent to the president's desk. They said, this is a civil rights bill. And they said, such citizens of every race and color, and without regard of any previous condition of slavery or involuntary servitude, shall have the same right in every state and territory in the United States to be able to purchase, inherit, lease, sell, hold, and convey real and personal property to the equal and full benefit as enjoyed by white citizens. Wow, 1866, folks, excuse me, 1866. And this was the Civil Rights Bill, Civil Rights Act of 1866, went to the president's desk, president vetoed it. Excuse me, went to the president's desk again, president vetoed it yet a second time. And it wasn't until there was a 2/3 majority vote by Congress that the Civil Rights Act of 1866 was ratified and became law. So here we are, we're moving again in the right direction. And I'll tell you, when we look at Reconstruction, we saw that in 1870, the first African-American congressman, and who was Senator Hiram Revels out of Mississippi, and Representative Joseph Rainey out of South Carolina, they became the first African-Americans to serve in Congress. And what was interesting is that we saw several African-American congressmen and senators between the years of 1870 up until 1877. Now, what's interesting is that we started to see these gains in our society, but 1877 changed things, because although we saw two senators between 1870 and 1877, two African-American senators, and by 1877, there were 8 African-American representatives in the US House of Representatives, it would be about another 100 years before we saw one more African-American senator. And it would be about another 100 years before we saw the numbers of African-Americans being represented in the US, in Congress. And, one might ask the question, well, why was that? Why did we see such gains right away, and then we saw it all sort of go away and regress? And as W.E.B. Du Bois said, the slave went free, stood for a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again towards slavery. And I think that this is true when we look at Special Field Order number 15. Almost got there. We almost really set ourselves in terms of our nation, set ourselves up in a place where everyone was going to have equal opportunity as it relates to real estate ownership. We saw the Civil Rights Bill, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which said that all men are going to be able to have equal rights as it relates to purchasing, inheriting, leasing, selling, and holding real and personal property. We saw that, but things changed. Things changed in a hurry. Now, one of the challenges that we had with the Civil Rights Act of 1866 is that there were no enforcement provisions. So although we have this act that says that, all citizens are going to be able to, lease and hold and purchase and convey real property, there was no provision. So if a Black guy went to try to buy a piece of property from a white guy, and the white guy said, no, I'm not doing that. It was just that. There was no enforcement provisions. So the Civil Rights Act didn't really do a whole lot as it relates to creating equality among our society. Now, another thing that I want to point out here is that laws and policies have always been there. And one of the themes that you'll see here this morning or this afternoon is that we've had laws and policies, but they don't really get the job done. Because they don't get that job done because unless we can change the hearts and minds of people, then we're going to continue to struggle. We're going to continue to not get to the level of equity and inclusion that we deserve in our society. And this is something that benefits all of us. And that's why we have to work together to make sure we're doing all that we can to create more equitable opportunities and a more inclusive society. So let's move along to 1877. And what happened in 1877, which really changed the tide of history in terms of the way that we were moving in, as a society here in our country. So in 1877, here pictured, we've got Rutherford B. Hayes. He was Ohio's governor, and he was running for president against New York's governor, Samuel Tilden. And it was a contentious race. And I'll tell you, people didn't know who was going to emerge victorious in this race. And Ruffy had a great idea. He went to the southern states, the yet to be reconstructed southern states, and said, I'll tell you what, if you support me in my candidacy for president, then if I'm successful, then what I'm going to do, one of the first things I'll do is I'll remove all the federal troops from your states, and we'll allow you to handle this inclusion, this segregation issue as you see best. We know you'll do the right thing. So there we have it. So as a result of that, the leaders of the southern states said, yeah, we like that. We'll do that. We're going to support you, Ruthie. So Rutherford B. Hayes became president. We know this as the Compromise of 1877. And the great words of abolitionist Frederick Douglass, say it best, that the freedmen were left naked unto their enemies. And that's exactly what happened. Because as we know, this ushered in the Jim Crow era of the South. And, we saw all of the gains that were afforded and that were earned by African Americans and others quickly regress, and they were left in a position that in many ways may have been worse than enslavement for some. And we don't have time today for me to get into all of the examples of that, or even a few of the examples of that. So I'll just summarize by saying that African Americans had to leave. Okay, Blacks were looking for greener sun, greener pastures and warmer suns. So as a result, they started to make their way north. And we look at 1910, in 1910, more than 90% of the African American population lived in the South. And by 1970, we had less than 50% there. So we saw this population disperse across the great United States. And we know this as the Great Migration. The Great Migration, looking for, we started to see factories and, the Industrial Revolution taking hold and such. So there were more opportunities that folks were looking for as they started to make their way north and west. Excuse me. Okay, now one of the challenges that African Americans encountered as they started to make their way north and west was by us. And what I mean by us is the National Association of Realtors. Us as realtors, the National Association of Real Estate Boards, we were called at the time. Because, what happened, and just a little bit of, a little aside, racial-based zoning was legal in our country up until 1917, which meant that you could zone neighborhoods for Caucasians. You could zone neighborhoods and say that this neighborhood is for African Americans, this neighborhood is for foreign-born populations, so on and so forth. So that was perfectly legal up until that was struck down in 1917 by the United States Supreme Court. So there were other ways around that. And some of those ways were championed by us. And by us, I mean realtors. Because if we look at the Code of Ethics back in 1924, what we see is this. We see Article 34, which says that a realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood a character of property, members of any race or nationality whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values in that neighborhood. Wow. I mean, here we are, we've got our National Association of Realtors stepping in with this article to say that we as realtors should not be integrating communities. That's not our role. So let's step back for just a second, because some of you may be thinking, look, I wasn't a realtor back then. I wasn't even born back then. And I'll tell you too, I wasn't born back then, certainly, and I wouldn't have been able to be a realtor. As a Black guy, I certainly wouldn't have been able to be a realtor back then. But let me share this with you. We are all responsible for this. And what I mean by that is, let's take the example of a house. We've got a 100-year-old house that we buy. Now, we own that house, but we didn't build the house, but we're responsible for maintaining it, upgrading it, and doing whatever it is that we want to do with that particular home. So the National Association of Realtors is our house. We didn't create that house, but we own it. We're members of it. So it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we're upgrading it and enhancing it and making decisions that are going to be in the benefit of everyone, as opposed to some of the decisions in the past that were not made to benefit everyone within our society. So we're all responsible. We all have a voice here, and we all have to make sure that we're doing what's necessary to create equitable outcomes in our communities and within our boards and associations as well. All right, so let's move on to the 1930s. So we've got Franklin Delano Roosevelt pictured here. And what we know was happening in the 30s was the Great Depression. We had the Great Depression. And of course, the Great Depression, it smacked everybody, at the time, and it was really tough to create opportunities for people to have, good employment outcomes, to, food. People were in line for soup. There were all types of, terrible situations that were occurring in our nation that, as a result of this Great Depression, that we were mired in. Now, at the same time we were mired in this Great Depression, we've got the drumbeat of war marching across Europe. And, the thought leaders in our country thought, wow, what are we going to do to ensure that our fragile democracy survives? So as a result of that, excuse me, we saw the invention, or we saw the passage of the National Housing Act. And the National Housing Act in 1934 created the FHA. And the FHA said that, basically, as we know, its purpose was to make credit more available to lenders and home repair for construction of housing, have a low down payment investment to achieve home ownership. And that was phenomenal, because at the time we had around 35% of our nation were homeowners. We were not a nation of homeowners. And once the FHA was created, and by the time we get into the 70s and 80s, we saw that rate of homeownership go from 35% all the way up to about 75%, which is phenomenal. Now, the challenge with the FHA loan, as many of you may be aware, is that it was not available for everyone. Because in fact, between the years of 1934, when the FHA loan was created, up until the passage of the Federal Fair Housing Act in 1968, we saw less than 2%, 2% of FHA loans issued to non-white families within our country. So that was a challenge, that was a challenge, because this really worked to create the middle class. And there were a lot of folks that were left out of those opportunities within our country. And here's a look at the FHA underwriting manual, because it wasn't just us as realtors that were discriminating. It was our federal government, because the federal government's own FHA underwriting manual from 1938 said this: if a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that properties shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. A change in social and racial classes generally contributes to instability and decline in values. Now, this is not true, by the way. It wasn't true until it was put in writing. And what I mean by that is, once it was put in writing, it became a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. But prior to that, when you saw integration in communities, property values actually went up, because, as you could imagine, certainly not all neighborhoods were going to be welcoming to African Americans and others. So when a neighborhood was welcoming, then the African Americans would be willing to pay more because those are the limited options that they have. So as a result, property values would go up in those neighborhoods. But once this was codified in writing as this, that sort of changed the tide, because what was encouraged was recorded deed restrictions, which we know is restrictive covenants. And these restrictive covenants talked about the occupancy and who could live in that property. Prohibition of the occupancy of properties except for the race in which they are intended. Now remember, I just told you 1917, racial-based zoning was struck down by the Supreme Court. But yet, in 1938, in our FHA underwriting manual, you'll see that that race-based zoning is alive and well. It only looks a little bit differently as in terms of how it's brought across, because it's brought across through not zoning, but through racially based restrictive covenants. And as a result, we would see these maps being created all over the nation. This is a map of St. Louis, my hometown. And you see here that the areas that were deemed red were dangerous. The areas that were yellow were definitely declining. The green areas were the best, so on and so forth. And what was happening is that FHA had a mandate for banks to lend only in those areas that were not in red. And we call that redlining, of course. Here's Los Angeles, 1939. Because it certainly wasn't just in one area or another. Here's Cleveland, Cuyahoga County in 1940. Here's New York. We've got Brooklyn, New York, 1938. We've got Rochester, New York, 1935. So this was all over. This was all over. And this really, shut the door to housing opportunities for so many folks in our nation. So when we look at signs that we would see in the communities around the country. We want white tenants in our white community. Christians only, Jews not welcome. We serve whites only, no Spanish, no Mexicans, no Irish, no blacks, no dogs. These were things that we saw. This is an example of, we saw very overt discrimination and racism. Now today, what I'll say is that these signs still exist in many communities, but they're not overt, they're more covert. You don't see the signs, but the attitudes are still prevalent and they still exist. And that's something that we have to work together to create better outcomes as a result of. So let's go to your market and look at Levittown. Levittown here, this was 1947. So around 1945, 1947, William Levitt and his company, Levitt and Sons, were building housing for the soldiers coming home from war, And, we had extreme housing shortage in our country. And let me tell you how short the housing was in our nation at the time. In the first 3 hours that this neighborhood was taking reservations, they reserved 1,400 homes. 1,400 homes in 3 hours. Now, initially, this was a rental development, and then it certainly turned into home ownership opportunities, and the goal was to create home ownership opportunities as well. Now, when we look at the affordability of these homes, they were extremely affordable. They cost about $8,000, which may have been, somewhere if you factor inflation, all that good stuff, it's about $100,000 that somebody would have spent for that home today. So extremely affordable homes, twice the median income average nationwide. Excuse me. So if we look that of those 1,400 homes, although African Americans, although Jewish people, Hispanic people, and others were building these homes, they weren't ever allowed to occupy them. So because the racial-based zoning, the racial-based deed restrictions forbid anyone except for the Caucasian race from occupying or using these homes. And that was FHA policy. This was an FHA finance development. William Levitt himself, Jewish, was the developer, but Jews were not allowed to live there. So this was a federal policy that really created segregation and perpetuated the homogenization of neighborhoods, which still exists today, as we know. So the next point that I want to make in terms of fostering a climate of diversity and inclusion is to use privilege effectively. Now, I can't hear any of you, but I know that there was a collective gasp, maybe not a collective gasp, but there was a gasp by some people that said, oh my gosh, here we go, privilege. What is that all about? Let me tell you, the best definition of privilege that I ever heard was from Dr. Peggy McIntosh. And this is what she said. Privilege is an invisible package of unearned assets which one can count on cashing in each and every day, but about which one is largely oblivious. Okay? Sit with that for just a second. Now, let me share this story. So, I'm a realtor, of course, as you know, as many of you know, and I am in St. Louis. That's my market. I'm helping buyers and sellers achieve their goals every day with my team. And, excuse me. So, one day, I've got a client coming into town. We've talked over the phone, but we've not met in person yet. So they're coming in town. We're going to be taking them to show them a couple of properties. And it just so happened that I was unavailable on the afternoon that he was coming to town to take a look at some properties. So I asked my team member, my senior agent partner, I asked her, hey, are you available on Thursday afternoon to show these properties to Brian, and who's coming in town? And she said, she starts asking me all these questions. And I'm like, I'm like, why are you asking me all these questions? This is Brian. He's a client, he's not a stranger. And she said, but he's a stranger to me. And that hit me like a ton of bricks, because I had the privilege of, being a man and having a different sort of expectation of safety in doing my job and helping buyers and sellers achieve their real estate goals. She had a different expectation of safety, and she was more concerned about meeting a man in a property where she had never met this man before. I didn't have that same concern. So this is a privilege that I wasn't aware of that I even had. So because it's an invisible package, it's not something that that I know that I have. I didn't earn it. I didn't earn being a man. I didn't earn the fact that I am cashing in each and every day, what I'm able to accomplish as a result of, that sort of difference in safety expectation. And I was largely oblivious of it until she pointed it out to me. And I think that that's how many of us work. We are oblivious of various levels of privilege that we may have. And, we may have privilege because of our ethnicity. We may have privilege because of our gender, because of our height, because of our weight, because of a variety of different things. There's all types of things that may afford us privilege in certain circumstances, which may cause us to be at a disadvantage in other environments. So we've just got to think about that and really understand how our privilege, because we all have different privileges that we have the opportunity to use effectively, can be brought into play. So our example, excuse me. So the example of using privilege effectively, if we go back in our history lesson, we've got Shelley versus Kramer. Shelley versus Kramer, and this is 1948. So in 1948, what was happening is that the Shelley family bought a home in a neighborhood, and the Kramer family said, hey, you guys are Black. This neighborhood is for whites only. It's in the restrictive covenants. It's in the deed restrictions. You can't occupy this property. So the first question you might ask, well, how did they even buy a property in a neighborhood that had these deed restrictions? Well, this is where using privilege effectively came into play, because their attorney, who was white, said, you know what, I believe that people should be able to achieve home ownership in any community that they can afford. So as a result, he put his name on the contract, and people thought that he was the person who was buying this home. And then when time came for closing, they switched it up, and the Shelley family was able to buy the home. And that's how they were able to buy it. They were moving in. The Kramer family didn't like it, went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, they kind of punted, I'll tell you. They really did. What they said is that restrictive covenants on their face are not invalid under the 14th Amendment. However, while private parties may voluntarily abide by these restrictive covenants, there shall be no judicial enforcement, because judicial enforcement would constitute state action. Now, work with me here. Basically, what the Supreme Court said that privately, if residents decide, hey, I don't want to sell my home to folks other than Caucasians, no problem there. If folks say, I am happy to sell my home to anyone whose money's green, no problem there. But there's not going to be any, because there's not going to be the courts involved in settling any disputes as it relates to restrictive covenants. So as one could guess, it didn't quite work out all that great. Now, granted, it did open up housing. It opened up housing quite a bit in some neighborhoods, but in other neighborhoods, that just wasn't the case, because again, you're leaving it up to people. And as I said before, unless and until we change the hearts and minds, we're still gonna have the same challenges over and over and over. So one of the things that lifting this restrictive covenants, what it did was it ushered in an era of a new type of hostility, and we call these blockbusters. So blockbusters, what they would do is they would come into neighborhoods now, and they would peddle fear into the hearts and minds of the the white families that live there, and said, hey, guess what? They sold their house to the Jones family down the street. You know what that means? They're all coming. You better sell me your house at a discount while you still can. Okay. So a lot of people gave into that fear. So the blockbusters, excuse me. So the blockbusters, peddling that fear, were very successful in buying these houses on the cheap and running white families out of town because of the fear that they were peddling. So then what they would do is they would turn around and they would sell these homes to Black families at inflated prices. Now, you might have saw me say sell these homes in quotes, because what they were doing was, they'd go back to places and say, hey, homes for colored available, right? And Black folks will say, well, I can't get financing in that neighborhood. That's a white neighborhood. Remember, FHA is not going to finance housing in white neighborhoods. So what would happen, to African Americans or other people of color? So what would then happen is that the blockbusters would say, oh, that's no problem. We'll carry the paper. We'll finance it for you. And they would sell the homes on contract for deed basis. Contract for deed meant that you didn't accrue any home ownership during the period that you had that you were making this payment until you made that final payment, which meant that if you had a 10-year note, let's say, and you paid your payment every month on time for 9.5 years, the 1 month that you're late, you can be evicted out on the streets, and the blockbuster can start all over again, selling it to another unsuspecting family. And these houses were inflated in price. They were jacked up 50, 60, 70% because African Americans and others were desperate for housing. They were looking to get out of these slums that they were relegated to. So they had no choice but to be able to, to take advantage of every opportunity they could to get into a decent neighborhood. And that's what the blockbuster offered. There was a Duke University study. Duke said that 3/4 of homes sold to Black Chicagoans, so this is in Chicago alone, in the 50s and 60s, were contract for deed. And so as a result, they were, marked up on average 84%. And what that resulted in, it was a loss of $3 to $4 billion of wealth just in the African American community in Chicago alone. This was happening all over the country, folks, all over the country. All right, so Charlotte Bronte said, prejudices, it is well known, are most difficult to eradicate from the heart, whose soul has never been loosened or fertilized by education. They grow there firm as weeds among rocks. That's Charlotte Bronte. Excuse me. So now we're going to move forward to another Levittown, this time Levittown, Pennsylvania. Levittown, Pennsylvania, and this is 1957. So 1957, we've got William and Daisy Myers. They moved into the Dogwood Hollow section of Levittown, and these were the types of neighbors that anybody would want to have. You know, he was an engineer, she was a school teacher. I mean, what wonderful neighbors, except for they were Black. So this was the first Black family that was integrating Levittown in Pennsylvania. And of course, as you know, there's half a dozen Levittowns in the East Coast: Levittown, New York, Levittown, Pennsylvania, and so on and so forth. So let me show you a quick little video here that that talks a little bit about the thoughts of the neighbors in the Levittown community that the Myers family was moving into.
And we understood that it was going to be all white, and we were very happy to buy a home here.
Do you think a Negro family moving here will affect the community as a whole?
Definitely.
In what way?
I think that, well, the property values will immediately go down if they are allowed to move in here in any numbers.
But there are others who are for the Myers?
Yes, I've read about them.
For what reason, do you think, do they support the Myers?
Frankly, I don't know what reasons they can have for it. If they are homeowners in Levittown, I don't see what reasons they can have for it.
Do you think Myers will be able to live here comfortably?
Comfortably? No.
What course of action are you going to follow?
I'll do what I can to help to get them out legally and peacefully. And as far as accepting them socially, if that's what you mean, I could never do that.
Do you think the Myers will be able to live comfortably in Levittown?
I think so. I hope so. I think the majority of people here will grow accustomed to it and realize that, they can be good neighbors, which I'm sure they are. And I think the majority of people here are not the violent, violent group that we have heard so much about.
All right, so we've got a couple of perspectives there. You heard the first perspective. You know, the woman said that, you know, I could never accept them socially. I'm going to do whatever I can to get them out legally. Now, of course, we know there's no legal way to get them out. They were rightful owners of the home that they purchased. And she said, I bought the home and understood that this was going to be an all-white neighborhood, and I was happy to buy a home here. And that was, you know, that was a perspective that a lot of people had at the time. Now, it would be easy for us to wag our fingers and, you know, demonize her, you know, for her views. But the reality is that if we're looking in 1957, your average white family did not have any meaningful interactions with African Americans or others for that matter. Schools were segregated, employment was segregated, you know, so there was never that kind of meaningful interaction that one would expect to have happen. So, you know, the perception that she had is likely from just a lack of understanding, you know, a lack of just knowing people. And that is, you know, that's something that's really critical in terms of making sure that we understand each other, is getting to know each other for sure. So the second woman, she had a different perspective. Excuse me. Her perspective was, oh, I'm sure the Myers family are going to be just fine. You know, not everybody's like that. You know, when you get a new neighbor, you know, you want to say, maybe bake them a pie, take them a cake or a plant or something. Welcome to the neighborhood. She's going to be the type of person that says, you know, welcome to the neighborhood. I'm sorry that you're experiencing this trouble, but we're not all like that. Let me know if there's anything I can do to make your stay more pleasant and welcome you into the neighborhood. So that's all good, except for what was happening, right? So that's from the documentary Crisis in Levittown. And what we know is that the Myers family were greeted not by plants and cakes and pies, but by 2 weeks of rioting outside their doors, 2 weeks of rioting. Now, not only were there bricks thrown through their windows, crosses burned in their yards, car terrorized, them being terrorized and vandalized, all of those things happening. Not only was all of that happening, but that second woman, and this is what I believe that there's more people like the second woman than like the first woman. What I mean, it's like Anne Frank. Despite everything, I believe that people are good at heart. I believe that. And the second woman would have been a great example. But what's going to happen is that she's the one that delivers the pie. And she delivers the pie. And guess what? She gets bricks thrown through her window. She gets crosses burned in her yard. She's no longer allowed to, have afternoon tea with the ladies. Her children are no longer allowed to play with the other children in the neighborhood, or the other children won't play with their children, with her children. And we've got to ask ourselves about courage and bravery, because if you know that that's going to happen, how quick are you going to be to bake that pie and deliver it to your neighbor? You might say, you know what, we're just going to have pie for dinner tonight, because I don't have any trouble with the Myers family, but I don't want trouble for myself. And that's something that we've got to get over. We've got to do better than that, because that's why we continue to have some of these challenges in our society today, because we allow that vocal minority to win the day over the quiet majority. And, Dr. King said, and speaking of the civil rights movement, this time will be remembered not for the violence and vitriol of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. And that's where we sit today. We've got this appalling silence sometimes that allows for that vocal minority to win the day and move us backwards as it relates to creating inclusive communities. And that's something that we all have to work together as realtors and as community leaders to create better outcomes, different outcomes than what we've seen. Because if we just look for inertia to solve this for us, then we're going to get what we've always got. We'll make a little bit of incremental improvement, but we'll take these steps back all the time. And we won't ever get to the place that we deserve to be at in our society as it relates to having this fostering this diverse and inclusive environment, which is to the benefit of everyone in our society, for sure. So that was Levittown, 1957. So another point that I want to make in terms of fostering an environment of diversity and inclusion is counter the stereotypes. Often, and when we look at that example, when we looked at those blockbusters, when they were knocking on somebody's door, they were peddling that fear. Remember, they didn't know anybody. The white families, the average white family did not have any meaningful interaction. So they knew only what they saw on television, what they learned from their parents, what they learned in schools, those sorts of things. That's all they knew. So it was very easy for them to be influenced by the peddlers of fear that the blockbusters embodied. So what we have to do is counter those stereotypes. When you're in a group of people and someone says something adverse about a member of the out group, it's your responsibility to speak that truth, to say, no, I don't appreciate that. They're not like that. That's just a stereotype. Because I promise you that if you're in a group of 10 people and one person is saying something like that, a lot of people are going to be silent. And that silence is often viewed as acceptance, when in reality, they don't want any trouble for themselves, as we were just talking about in terms of the Myers family. So we've got to counter those stereotypes. Another example of countering the stereotypes, when a Negro moves next door. This was a Saturday Evening Post, 1959. They had an article that talked about what would happen when a Negro moves next door, because people just didn't know. And say, oh, guess what? They want to cut their grass. They want to send their kids to school. They want to put food on the table. They want to do all the things that you want to do. The woman pictured here in the lower left, that's Estelle Sachs. And she worked against the blockbusters to say, hey, look, we should not allow these folks to come in and destroy our communities. They're terrorizing us. They're destroying these communities. We need to welcome our brothers and sisters of different races into our neighborhoods and live together. And she was successful in some areas, not all areas, certainly. And that leads us to bias. Part of it is the bias. When we look at our implicit bias, this is going to affect our understanding and attitude on that conscious level. But the bigger issue often comes in terms of our our implicit bias over our explicit bias, because explicit bias, we know what we have a problem with. Implicit bias is things that we don't even know that we have a problem with. We don't know that we feel a certain adverse way towards a particular person, group, or thing, or we don't know we have a positive feeling or a negative feeling. That's implicit. And we've got to really work to uncover those and discover our own implicit biases, because we all have them. We do. And if we act like these things don't exist, then we're not going to move the ball forward in terms of creating the inclusive communities that I talked about. Here, these are a couple of towns in New York. And what we know that they have in common, these are all sundown towns. So these are places that African Americans and other people of color were not allowed to be in once the sun went down. So this is another example of how our communities remain segregated, because folks were not allowed to live in these communities, not even be there after dark. And that created, again, the segregated communities that we still see today. So then the next point in fostering an environment of diversity and inclusion is to be intentional. So we want to rethink how we think about our relationships, and, look at who we're connected with. Are we making an effort to reach out to people that are not like us? Everybody knows who this is. The chairman of the board, Frank Sinatra. He worked to integrate Las Vegas with his friend Sammy Davis Jr. When he asked Sammy to come to see a show in New York where Frank appeared, Sammy couldn't get in. You know what Frank did? Frank came back the next day, tore up the contract, and never performed there again, because they were not being inclusive. They weren't allowing this. So he was working to create different opportunities in creating diversity and inclusion. And one of the reasons he did it, because he was discriminated against himself as an Italian American. And as we know, first and second generation immigrants into our country typically have that experience. And he took that power that he was able to earn, and he made a difference. And we saw Las Vegas being integrated as a result of that, because he was the one who could do that. So he could be the change that he saw that needed to happen in the country. Fair housing becomes law. This here is California. This is another example of fostering an environment of inclusion and diversity. In 1963, this was before the Federal Fair Housing Act ever came into play. We saw the Rumford Fair Housing Act create a lot of opportunities to prohibit people to deny housing based on ethnicity, religion, or national origin. The challenge again came with us as realtors, because a year later, we passed Proposition 14. And Proposition 14 said that basically repealed everything that the Rumford Fair Housing Act did. And you see the sign, realtors foster bigotry. That's exactly what we were doing. And this is why we have to work so hard today to create different outcomes. The child who's not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. That's an African proverb. And it really speaks to what was happening in the 60s, because we've got the Watts Rebellion, which was a direct result of Proposition 14. That was passed by the California Association of Realtors. Dr. King said this is environmental and not racial. The economic deprivation and social isolation, inadequate housing, and general despair of thousands of Negroes teeming in northern and western ghettos are the ready seeds which give birth to these tragic expressions of violence. Excuse me. And of course, that brings us to 1968, where we have the Civil Rights Act, that was passed to prohibit race, color, religion, prohibit discrimination based on race, color, religion, national origin. We've got some cases that help that along, Jones versus Mayer. Then that brings us to 1974, where we get the Housing and Community Development Act that amended the Fair Housing Act to include sex as a protected class. And then we get to 1988, where we have the Fair Housing Amendments Act, which added disability and familial status as protected classes. And today, over 50% of complaints, I serve on the board for the Metropolitan St. Louis Equal Housing Opportunity Council, and over 50% of the complaints that come across our desk, and this is certainly true nationwide, are disability discrimination cases. So we've got a long ways to go, and it's not just about race, it's not just about gender, it's about a holistic variety of challenges and different levels of diversity that we need to work to make sure that we're fostering those inclusive environments. Familial status. So as we get to where we're at today, we have race, color, religion, national origin, sex, disability, and familial status as our protected classes. Now, if we look at the National Association of Realtors, of course, we do have a couple of additional protected classes, and that is sexual orientation and gender identity. So at the end of it all, you know, I know that I'm short on time, so I'd love to take a couple of questions if anyone has any, but I want to just sort of reiterate what we covered in terms of fostering an environment of diversity and inclusion. And those 5 points are to talk less and listen more. We want to be intentional, because if we're not intentionally inclusive, then we're unintentionally exclusive. We want to counter the stereotypes and let people understand, help people understand that no, it's not like that. That's an inaccurate portrayal of this particular group of people. We want to use our privilege effectively. And of course, we want to be the change. We want to be the change that we want to see. And, you know, it's like Margaret Mead said, never doubt that a small group of concerned citizens can change the world, because indeed it is the only thing that ever has. So thank you so much for allowing me to be with you today and share some information. I've got a link here, my diversity, equity, and inclusion reading list. So there's videos, there's a couple movies, there's documentaries, podcasts, and things like that. So if you have any interest in continuing the conversation here, I know that I'm kicking off Fair Housing Month for you, but this is a great resource, I think, that can help give you a couple of things that you can read up on and sort of continue your own knowledge and listen more and talk less, as we said. So with that, I'll turn it back over and certainly welcome any questions. Again, thank you so much.
All right, Nate, thank you so much. That was great. I don't see any questions right now. I think you covered it all. So I just wanted to say thank you for the great presentation. And I think we'll end it here.
All right, fantastic. Thanks so much. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.